Sorry, 1 second. There we go. Sorry about that. There. So I also talk a little bit about how I'm going to run through the topic. I'm going to talk about why bumblebees specifically, and then talk a little bit about pollinators and their relationship to the ecosystem. And then I want to talk about the other people who are doing this work, and because there's so much work being done, and there are people who've been working on this for the last number of years, and how those conservation efforts are going and what their results have been. And then specifically details about Irish bee species and how to spot bumblebees and how you can learn to tell the difference between different species. As even just as you're walking around, eventually you start to being able to tell even very small bees, you start to be able to spot the differences between them after a while, just as they go by. And then talk specifically about one of the most important things that we need to do for bee conservation, which is habitat. And then very briefly, the new nature restoration law and how that's going to influence all of this. So first and foremost, why bumblebees? I think that it's easy to kind of get caught up in the sort of rhetoric of save the bees because it became such a meme, it became such a slogan that it's not a hard thing to catch people's attention with when you're talking about bees. But why to talk about bumblebees specifically as opposed to we have solitary bees, we have honeybees? The main reason is because when we're talking about what needs to be done for conservation and habitat, it's wild bees that are the most affected rather than honeybees, which are obviously tend to be more domesticated. And bumblebees are recognizable. They're what I like to call an ambassador species. They're sort of charismatic, or as charismatic as insects can be. And that can be a hard sell to get people invested in. But bumblebees are calm. You can see this is a picture of me from years back on a survey where I had bumblebees crawling all over me. And if you're behaving sensibly, they tend not to sting, especially earlier in the year when you'd only have the drones. And they're sort of fluffy, they're easily recognizable, they're big enough to spot. They tend to fly slowly, and people see them a lot in the summer. People associate them with nice days outside. And it's an easy way to catch people's attention. And that's why they're an ambassador for a whole range of less charismatic insects that we are also preserving when we do the work to preserve bumblebees. And yeah, I think in some ways they're sort of like a little gateway drug to caring about biodiversity for people who either haven't cared about it before or just haven't had the opportunity to learn. Because there are a lot of people out there who would probably be really interested if the information ever really been offered to them. But we don't do a lot of environmental education in schools. And so there's a lot of people who just don't have that information. And so, in terms of pollinators, I don't think it's particularly controversial these days to talk about the significance of pollinators. I think it's become a very mainstream conversation. The concept that we very much need to be aware of this an issue, the declining populations, and how much that's going to affect us in a very self-serving way. I mean, if we go along to these slides given by the Biodiversity Data Center, these are some of the really like kind of stark numbers they were using in their original plans to kind of talk to people about how important pollinators were just to our ability to feed ourselves, to our economy, how much it's worth. It is a self-serving way of looking at it, but sometimes you do need to, in the context where there's a lot happening in the world, there are a lot of issues, people have a lot of things to be worried about. Sometimes you need to highlight how crucial an issue is and how much we are very much in crisis. That these collapsing populations, it's happening now, it's happening rapidly, and it's not something that can really be put off for a later date because it will affect everything we know about the environment around us. And that environment around us is not an abstract concept. It's not the idea of a sunny afternoon. It's not the, sort of romantic notion of nature. It's literally you walk outside, and if you've experienced the world, then that's the environment we're talking about. And that can be a less inviting version of events. That's a harder line and more negative view, which also that's a conversation that also needs to be happening. You can't always have the light, fluffy version of environmental conservation. You do also have to have the stark numbers, this is happening now conversation. But it's good to be able to pick your moments as to when that's an appropriate way to kind of pull people into talking about conservation. So in terms of the groups that have been really involved in this, first and foremost, I have to talk about the National Biodiversity Data Centre. So that's a semi-state agency based down in Waterford who do absolute Trojan work for monitoring all sorts of species, plants and animals, across Ireland, and being able to track their populations, track their movements, allows people to be able to make informed decisions and informed policy about what needs to be done for wildlife in Ireland. And they have done a lot of very specific work on bees and bumblebee monitoring. They were the publishers of the All Ireland Pollinator Plan, which I'm going to get to next. And they have the Bumblebee Monitoring Scheme, which I'm also going to discuss, which allows us to get a sense of population, distribution, and what the kind of pinch points for threats to them are. And so they've really been the cornerstone of all of this. The Irish Wildlife Trust, when their plans first came out, put on a lot of small public talks to talk to people about pollinators, to talk to people about bumblebees, and to get the work that the Biodiversity Data Centre was doing kind of out into the grassroots, because it won't shock anyone to learn that it's not a wildly well-funded organization, and it did not have the staff to be meeting with people all over the country as regularly as they needed to get the message out. So, the Wildlife Trust stepped in and took on some of that. And one of the sets of groups that they met with were the Tidy Towns committees. Those were some very, very successful talks. I was very lucky to be able to be part of that at the time. And we met, there was not just me, but many people, but we met with Tidy Towns committees who, at first, there's a stereotype that you're not going to necessarily get a lot of buy-in. There's a particular image of what Tidy Towns committees style is. But I found ultimately they were very positive interactions, because these were people who did ultimately care very much about their local area. And so it wasn't a hard jump to make to add this into the way in which they cared about their area. And ultimately that led to the inclusion of a pollinator award within the Tidy Towns committee, within the Tidy Towns competition, I mean, which actively focused on specifically how biodiverse your local area was in your town and what you had done to put in place pollinator-friendly areas. Then obviously the National Parks and Wildlife Service are responsible for all nature reserves, a great deal of public land if it's being managed for biodiversity. And so they were a very important partner for these actions as well, and they manage far more land than really anybody else involved. And on a much smaller scale was the Great Yellow Bumblebee project. The Great Yellow Bumblebee is the largest bumblebee in Ireland, and it's also the most endangered. So its population has been pretty much reduced to just the Belmullet Peninsula in Mayo, which is just a little bit north of where I am in Achill. And it became sort of emblematic of the problem, because its population was so reduced. It did seem for a couple of years there as though it might be lost to us entirely. And that was a really important local project that people living in Belmullet came together in order to try and survey their area to see where was it still surviving, and put it in place all those actions to create habitat, to create foraging foods, reduce the use of pesticides in that area specifically, focused entirely on the Great Yellow Bumblebee. And it's been a really great community initiative. They're still running events out there now. And so all of these different groups, while they were operating independently, there was a great deal of collaboration. I think it was in many ways a great example of how to get this kind of project done well. And I think that's why I often come back to talking about the Bumblebee initiatives, because it wasn't just that it's so significant and that I think it's a very important kind of conservation, but I think it was also just done well. And it's a great model for people who are looking to put similar projects into play. And that was done through the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. So this was published in 2015, and it was a relatively simple document, but it was quite powerful in that it stated in very clear terms what the significance of pollinators were, why they were important, and then broke down in very clear, actionable terms what people could do about it. It laid out what species were most significant in terms of plant species, what was going to help the most, how to spread it out through the year, what different groups could do, breaking down, not like everyone has to do everything, but if you're working from a farmland perspective, these are the kinds of things you could do. If you manage a school or an institution or some kind of public land, these are things to bear in mind. If you're just working in a personal garden, these are things to think about. There was a lot of collaboration with county councils. There was the All Ireland Pollinator Conference in Athlone, I think in 2018 or 2019, I forget now. And that was a very interesting one, because that had representatives from county councils all over Ireland who were talking about the challenges they were facing in implementing these policies, but it also brought about One of my favorite quirks of this is, and some of you may have seen this in the last few years, when you're in a park or a public place and where a verge has been left uncut, especially around April or May, and let to grow long for wildflowers, you'll see these little signs that often look like this cover of the pollinator plan, and they'll say something like managed for pollinators or managed for biodiversity. And those signs were hugely important for county councils around Ireland because they found when they tried to implement the plan first, and where they'd left verges grow, where they'd left an area of a park maybe to one side of a playing pitch or under some trees, where they let it grow long and didn't cut that area, they received quite a few complaints in from people who were complaining that they weren't doing their jobs, who were complaining that this work wasn't being done, that it was being left untidy. And then when they put in these very small little signs, like you're talking about A4 pieces of paper on a wooden stick that just says manage for pollinators, manage for biodiversity. As soon as that was offered as an explanation, the complaints stopped. People didn't ring in and say, I don't care that you've put up this sign, I still want you to cut it. It genuinely changed people's entire perception of the same piece of grass being let grow long. And I think that was, for me, I think the clearest example of how the plan worked in terms of engagement and listening to people and responding when there was a point of conflict and responding when there was complaints quite well. And that was a very strong part of it. And then that obviously ran out in 2020 and it was renewed in 2021 for another set of 4 years. It didn't receive maybe the attention that it deserved at the time because it was being published in 2021. This was mid-COVID and people had other things to think about. But it does very much build off the success of the first plan and its strengths, which is very much in its stakeholder engagement. I think in terms of environmental projects, there's very few examples that were as positive as the All Ireland Pollinator Plan in terms of stakeholder engagement. Again, I think it is genuinely a model for all other forms of environmental communication. 55% of county councils are official partners to the pollinator plan, and obviously the plan is to grow this. And again, it breaks down very specifically guides for farmland, for public land, and for private land, recognizing that people are going to have different pressures and different issues on their land to take that into account. And they've published a series of guides for different groups and also how to get, there's a kids version, there are versions in Irish, there's ways to get different people engaged with the work that they're doing. And on pollinators.ie or on the National Biodiversity Data Centre website, they have a lot of free resources for people. And that's been very continuous as it went on, well-produced, simple guidelines for people that they can download for free and access for free. And so I think that's one of the reasons that it's been so successful. And so this is obviously the National Biodiversity Data Centre's website. They are the people who run all the monitoring, all the citizen science. And by citizen science, I mean that they let pretty much anyone join in the process of monitoring and recording wildlife and species across Ireland, because when you want to get the most amount of information, you want it all year round and you want it in every corner of the country, you can't possibly be relying on professional monitoring for all of that. Firstly, no one could afford it, but it also would just be incredibly unwieldy as a project to do. And so by getting just ordinary people out on their walks, out walking their dogs, to think for them though, well, if I've seen this particular thing, I know I have an app on my phone or there's a form on the computer when I get home, I can file this in 2 minutes and let someone know that I've seen it. And it goes in and all that data gets collated and it becomes so significant for how people are working these plans for conservation. Where are the crucial areas that we can do the most good? And they also run a series of courses about bumblebee conservation, and I'll talk about that more at the end. So bee species in Ireland, so bee species in Ireland, we have 98 different wild bee species. One of them is a honeybee species. It's the only native honeybee species that we have is Apis mellifera mellifera, which is the European black bee. And we have quite a significant population of that, even wild or feral, sort of a bit of a debate about how wild our wild bees are when it comes to honeybees, but they are there. We have a relatively significant population. They are not as threatened as other bee species. The wild bee species here in blue, because they're not being managed, there are beekeepers, there's beekeeping association, there's a real sense of the purpose of honeybees in life. And so they've kind of continuously throughout history had a greater sense of protection than wild bees, who aren't useful to us. They don't produce anything for us in a really immediate sense. We can't get honey from them. And so they have significantly less protection, traditionally speaking. There are 21 bumblebee species and 77 solitary bee species. And that's a figure that kind of surprises a lot of people. I think when they think of bees, one, people are either picturing just a bumblebee and they often think those are honeybees, or they think there's maybe two or three different types of bees. The fact that there are 98 does tend to take people off guard. And now, why am I talking about bumblebees and not solitary bees? The main reason is that there are 77 different types of solitary bee. And as if you look at this set of images, just to give you a sense of how many and how diverse they are, they also, many of them, don't look like bees at all. They look like flies, they look like hoverflies. At least one of them looks almost like a beetle. They are different types of bee, but they don't look like bees and they don't tend to be as cute as bumblebees. So it's harder to get people to engage with them. But also, they're genuinely hard to identify for a layperson. There are many of these bees that I wouldn't be able to identify, and some of them no one can identify outside of a lab setting. You would have to capture them and look at them under like a magnifying glass in order to be able to tell them apart. Just outside in a field somewhere, you just couldn't do it. So they're not necessarily the best thing to get citizen scientists engaged with in terms of community buy-in. Whereas, 21 bumblebee species, of which many are rare, is an easier sell. So obviously these are honeybees. And I think a lot of people are surprised by how dark Irish native honeybees are, and they aren't very black and yellow stripy like cartoon bees, that is bumblebees. And so again, when you're teaching people how to recognize them, it's already the bees that they think to look for. Most people aren't thinking to look for these bees. So solitary bees also they are mostly ground nesters. They're mostly mining bees, overwhelmingly. 62 of their 77 are mining bees. And I'm saying this because bumblebees are also largely mining bees. So while I'm not going to be talking about solitary bees, nearly all conservation efforts to help bumblebees will also help solitary bees. People just won't realize it at the time. There are some cavity nesters, 15 of them. And if you've seen these bee hotels, these are a quite common action for especially like schools and community groups to put together for solitary bees, because it's bees that would traditionally go in, say, little, if you can see in the top left there, small holes in wood or wooden fences, or mason bees. I think a lot of people have seen those little bees that come in and out of dry stone walls. So mason bees are probably, of the solitary bees, one of the rare examples that people might recognize, especially anyone who's ever worked on or near an old orchard. And old-fashioned orchards tended to have stone walls surrounding them. And while they did sometimes have honeybee hives in the middle of an orchard, you would often see small bees coming in and out of nests in the old stone walls of those orchards. And that's quite a common place to find mining bees, mason bees, I mean. Whereas other cavity nesting bees that are less well known, they're not as supported by these bug hotels as you might think. They're not a bad thing. They don't do any harm. So it's one of those things where I feel like I feel bad bursting people's bubble about the bug hotels because they don't do any harm. And if they help kids think about bugs, then that's still a positive. So if you're doing them with a school group and you're talking to kids about habitats for insects, yeah, that's still a good thing. You're still talking to children about the environment, and that's ultimately still a good, even if maybe one bee ever is going to live in that bug hotel. If you look in the bottom left corner of the slide, there's just a few holes drilled into the side of a wooden fence. That's actually a much more effective way of getting bees to nest, solitary bees to nest where you are. But that's why I'm kind of breezing over that, because ultimately it's hard to get people talking about solitary bees. But I do feel like sometimes like bursting the bubble a little bit on the bug hotels, because people can really fixate on these kind of easy, almost commercial answers to a complex question. If you can just go to Lidl and buy a bug hotel and put it up in your school and job done, then you feel like you've done something for bees. In reality, it's going to take a bit more than that. It's a bit more complicated than that. So bumblebees have a somewhat delicate life cycle, and this is one of the reasons their populations can be easily affected. They are a species where, unlike honeybees who hibernate or like live all through the winter as a group while individual bees might die, the bees survive the winter. Only the queens survive the winter in bumblebees. So they will come out of hibernation in spring, forage for a bit, find a nest site, and start laying eggs. And at that point, they will all come out of that nest until late summer, when she lays a few male eggs and a few potential queen eggs. And that's it. Only the queen, once the queens have made it, only the queens survive through winter. And what this means is that if queens are killed during hibernation in the winter, if there's nowhere for them to hibernate, or if their hibernation sites are disturbed, then it isn't just a case of one bee has been killed. It's actually more like 500 potential bees for the following year have been killed. So it can actually have a devastating effect on the population relatively quickly if somewhere where bees are hibernating is no longer available to them. And that's kind of one of the most significant parts of creating habitats for bees. It's places that aren't disturbed. So it isn't somewhere that's cut all the time. It isn't somewhere that's plowed. It isn't somewhere there's going to be digging or disruption. It's somewhere that's just kind of left alone. And that's why we're always going to come back to habitat and space, creating space as one of the most important conservation efforts. And that can be hard to sell because it's a sort of an anti-action. You tell people to throw wildflower seeds down or to build a bug hotel. That's fun because it's something you can do. When you're talking about habitats being left undisturbed, it's the opposite. You're telling people to do less, and that's a lot less engaging. So when we're talking about bumblebee species, these are our most common. These are the records for 2023. Common carder bee, I'll show you these species now in a second with photographs so you can get a sense of what they look like. To compare that to 2017, which is really as the pollinator plan was just really starting to get off, you can see that the numbers are, sorry, I think I'm actually blocking myself there, if I can move. You can see that there are much higher numbers, not just of the individual species, but also just of the records in general. Now, the problem with this is the Bumblebee monitoring scheme has not been going for that long. You're talking about 10 years, less than 10 years, and growing in awareness that whole time. So there are more recorders now than there were at the beginning. So there are more records. That doesn't necessarily mean that the population of these bees is increasing. So that's one of the reasons that you want people to be engaging with the monitoring scheme all the time, but also it has to run for as long as possible so that you can start looking at what's actually statistically significant in this information. It's not just that we're getting more of it because more people are interested. It's we're actually seeing either rises or falls in the populations of these species. So bumblebees, let's get on to the fun bit, which is recognizing which bees you're looking at when you're out in your garden. We're kind of coming to the end of bumblebee season. Right now, you're mostly going to be seeing the very last of the drones, or you might see male bumblebees, which really only come out in the end of the summer, and queens mating before queens find hibernation spots in September or October. That's been moving a lot. Climate change has kind of messed up exactly when that process happens. It's very weather dependent, but that's sort of where we're starting to hit that stage. So as I said, there's 21 different types of bumblebee, but you're not necessarily going to see all of them that often. There are a handful that are far more common. They also have a much higher range. This is actually the other point that I was going to make. Bumblebees can get within 5 kilometers. They can leave 5 kilometers between their nest and them, but they prefer to be within a kilometer of their nest. And so you need to be thinking about like relatively big areas that have multiple different sites for different bee nests at different points of the year. I'm going to actually come back to the species for planting in a minute because I want to talk about the monitoring program and how to identify bees. One of the things that I mentioned earlier that the Biodiversity Data Center does is they offer free online courses about bee identification. It'll go into a lot more detail than what I'm saying now because it's specifically designed for people who are going to sign up to their monitoring scheme and be part of that process. One of the easiest ways to know what bumblebee you're looking at is to look at its tail and then its stripes. So there are 4-ish, don't worry about that, species that have a properly white tail. There is 5 species that have a red tail. Only 1 species has like a properly ginger tail, and then 2 species have a blonde tail or yellow. The reason there's a little asterisk on 4 is because one of the white-tail species, its tail's not quite white, but we'll talk about that in a second. This is one of the most common bees in the country, especially if you live on the West Coast. It's more common than others, but it's common all over the country. You see it in every single county, and it's the common carder bee. It has a very ginger tail and a very ginger thorax. But what I will say to people who are spotting it out and about, when they're young, when the bee has first come out of the nest, they're very ginger and they have a lot of ginger hair on them. The black becomes more prominent as they have been out foraging for longer because they can lose their hair in rough weather. So if it's been a bit of a wet summer, you'll sometimes see common carders get like darker and darker colored as the season goes on. But they're incredibly common. You'll see them everywhere. The second most common is the buff-tailed bumblebee, and this is technically a white-tailed bee, but it's sort of a dirty white. So it's halfway between a yellow and a white tail. These are the biggest bees. If you've ever, around April or early May, you'll have people come, I have people come to me every year without fail and say, I've just seen the biggest bee. I've never seen a bee this size in my life. It was this big. It's just ridiculous. And it's always a buff-tailed queen because the queens are significantly larger than the regular bees. And when the buff-tailed queens are finding nests in in April, they startle people. People have never seen a bee this big before in their life. And it is one of the easiest to spot because they're so big. They're also very common. Which common carders or buff-tails, they go back and forth as to which is the more common. There are a lot of buff-tailed bees in Mayo at the moment for whatever reason, but that population comes and goes. And so they can be easy to spot. They also have two yellow stripes, but the yellow stripes are far apart from each other. White-tailed bumblebee, it's just an easy name, is another one of the very common ones. It has a pure white tail and two yellow stripes that are pretty far away from each other, one on the thorax and one on the tail. And sorry, not the thorax and the abdomen. Two bright yellow bands. And this one is a more regular bumblebee size. It's about the same size as the common carder. So if you can't see the tail clearly, size will often be the indication between this and a buff-tailed bee. Garden bumblebees are very easy to confuse with white-tailed bumblebees because they are also yellow and have a white tail, but they have three yellow stripes and sort of a horsey face, is kind of how we describe it. So if you look at the pictures of the face of this bee, it has a longer, horsier face, whereas the white-tailed bee, and this is not a great picture to tell, but you can take my word for it, it's got a much rounder face. Yeah, so you can see here, the one on the end is just a less common bee, so we're not gonna necessarily talk about that, but you can see the difference there between the shapes of the bee. This is the early bumblebee. It's one of my favorites personally. It's usually, as the name suggests, the first one to come out in spring, and it has a sort of red blush tail. It's not a very dark red tail, and it's very small. This one is the smallest bumblebee. Even the queens are quite small, and the drones, when they come out in summer, are very, very small. But they're almost more recognizable for that. And so you'll often see them in very early spring on things like willow, on very early violets, because they can often be very vulnerable if there isn't enough diversity in flowers. You have things that are flowering very early in the year. These can be really threatened by that. The red-tailed bumblebee, this is really common in Dublin. For whatever reason, I don't know anywhere other than the Dublin and the Wicklow Mountains that you'll see more of this particular bee. North Dublin, growing up, they were everywhere. And so these ones their body is entirely black with a red tail until this time of year when you'll start seeing the males, because they have one yellow stripe. That's how you know it's a male red-tailed bumblebee. But the rest of the year long, you'll see them. They're all black with a red tail. Quite common, especially on the East Coast. They can be confused with the mountain bumblebee, which is very, very similar, but which is also known as like the blueberry bee. You'll often see the mountain bumblebee on Frockin. So when Frockin is flowering before it comes into fruit, you'll see mountain bumblebees on that, and they have a similar kind of the habitat as Frockin. You'll only ever see them up on the very tops of hills in the mountains. They have a certain, if they're not above 500 meters above sea level, you can assume it's a red tail and not a mountain bumblebee. And that's why red tails are recorded so much more often, because people will see them in gardens, people will see them in parks, whereas unless you're up the Wicklow Hills, you're not going to be seeing mountain bumblebees. And so that's kind of, trying to keep an eye on the time, that is bees in general. And then really quickly, just at the end, before I take people's questions, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Nature Restoration Law, which has just come through, which Article 10 of that is about improving pollinator populations. It's really vague, like a lot of the Nature Restoration Law, because it's designed for member states to sort of make up their own version of it as is appropriate to their context. So all it really says is try to make the population trends improve. That's not a joke. That really is pretty much all it says. But what it does kind of situate it in a particular context, which is important, which is in the context of habitats. So, like I said, ultimately for bee conservation, one of the most important things we can do is have certain areas of land that are set aside that are undisturbed, that we are not messing with them continuously. They're not extractive. We're just saying this is just for plants and animals to live in. We can visit it, but we're not trying to constantly manage it. We're not interfering with it in terms of, soil disturbance or pesticide use. It's being let be. And they can be very small areas of land. They can be thin strips of land that are connected, or they can be big areas of land. It doesn't really matter, but there needs to be some there. And overall, that's what the nature restoration law is getting at. It's about monitoring space and making sure we're allowing enough space as opposed to just doing actions. And yeah, that is the main thrust of what I'm saying. So I think I could probably take questions in chat if anyone has any. Sorry, I went through a little fast because we started a little late. So I promise I'll talk slower if I'm asked questions.